Good afternoon and welcome. If you could just take a seat at any open seat, we're going to get started. I'm Sarah Dash. I'm President and Co-CEO of the Alliance for Health Reform, and on behalf of our Board of Directors and our staff, we'd like to welcome you to today's briefing on the future of the biosimilars market in the United States. We know there has been a tremendous amount of pharmaceutical innovation in the country, and people are placing a lot of hope in the capabilities of new biologic and biosimilar drugs to cure and treat illnesses that previously really didn't have as many opportunities to be treated. And we're now seeing the emergence of so-called follow-on biologics or biosimilars in the wake of the BPCIA, the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act, which passed in 2010. So at the Alliance, as many of you know, it is our mission to help explain and hopefully simplify some complex health policy issues, and we think we have a really good one for you today, and we have a really, really fantastic panel to help us in this discussion. So we're going to do this a little differently from a typical Alliance briefing. We're going to do this without PowerPoint. I'm going to introduce the panel, ask some questions of them, and then we'll stop about midway through, give the audience a chance to ask your questions, and then we'll wrap up the discussion. So for those who are watching on the live webcast or on Twitter, you can follow along using the hashtag Biosimilars. And let me go ahead and introduce our panel. Our panel is really fantastic, and they're going to talk to us about the science behind biosimilars today, as well as the legal and regulatory structure. And then really, we're going to get to what does this all mean for the day-to-day decisions of people who are going to make daily decisions, are already making daily decisions about what medicines to take or prescribe. Unfortunately, Sean Cavanaugh from CMS was going to join us today. He got called away at the last minute and will not be joining us, unfortunately, but we have plenty of brain power on the panel, so let me go ahead and introduce the panel. First to my left, we have Dr. Barbara Finck. She's the Chief Medical Officer of Coherus Biosciences, and she's really a pioneer in this field of biologics and biosimilars. She's a board-certified rheumatologist with more than 20 years of preclinical and clinical drug development experience in this space. We are also very fortunate. I'm going to go over here and say we have Leah Christl. She is the Associate Director for Therapeutic Biologics in the Office of New Drugs in the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER. She leads the therapeutic, biologic, and biosimilar staff and represents FDA with international regulatory agencies as well as trade and industry organizations for biosimilar-related activities. And then our next three panelists are going to help us really understand the day-to-day issues for those who are dealing with the emergence of this new market on the ground, so to speak. First, Leigh Purvis from AARP. We're delighted to have her. She's the Director of Health Services Research in AARP's Public Policy Institute, and she leads a team of policy analysts and researchers who work on healthcare issues that are relevant to the 50-plus population, as well as heading the Institute's work on prescription drug and mental health issues. And she has a lot of expertise in this area. Next, to her left is Dr. Angus. He is a practicing rheumatologist at Arthritis and Rheumatism Associates in Washington, D.C., and he is Clinical Assistant Professor of Medicine at Georgetown University Medical Center. He is also an active member of the American College of Rheumatology's Government Affairs Committee, Director of the Medical Society of the District of Columbia, and Chair of the Public Policy Education Committee of the Rheumatism Society of the District of Columbia. So he speaks frequently on health policy issues related to rheumatology care, and he's a graduate of Princeton University and University of Minnesota Medical School. And thank you for joining us, Dr. Worthing. And finally, of course, last but not least, we're delighted to have Brian Lehman. He is Manager of Pharmacy Benefits and Policy at the Ohio Public Employees Retirement System, which is also known as OPERS, and I'll refer to it as OPERS. The 11th largest public retirement system in the United States. He has more than 18 years of pharmacy plan management and retail pharmacy management experience, and previously was with Ohio State University as Director of Pharmacy Benefits at their health plan. So welcome to our whole panel. And so let me go ahead and kick off the discussion with a couple of questions just to set the stage. So first of all, many people in the audience have probably been following this issue for some time, but just for those of us who just need a little bit of a refresher, I'm going to turn to Dr. Barbara Finck from Coherus Biosciences and ask, just what is a biosimilar? What is it? Why are we talking about this now? And how is this different from generic drugs?
I think it's really an important question, but before I say what's a biosimilar, I'd like to sort of give you a context of why I'm the person sitting here to talk about it, right? So I've been in drug development for 20 years, and I actually was one of the innovators working for an innovative company and developing the originators. And I come from a company that was put together by many innovator veterans who've come together from different biological companies, and we came together with the single goal of focusing on providing these life-changing medications to patients. We felt that when we first developed these molecules and marketed them, they were pretty expensive at that time. But over the last 15 to 20 years, we've actually watched these drugs skyrocket in their costs. And for many patients, these drugs are not available, and they're life-changing. And so many of us who developed the originator molecules felt we needed to come together as a company and to actually make a difference, to actually change the dialogue and do something about the price. So we figured the way to do it was to provide competition. And that competition is through developing biosimilars. So let me tell you what a biosimilar is. Okay, so we all are pretty familiar with generic drugs. I take one of those myself. We're used to them because we know that they're chemical entities, right? And you can make them through a chemical reaction, and you can make them the same every single time that you make them, right? You just kind of stamp them out, and you know they're identical because chemically their structure's identical. A biosimilar, it's called a biosimilar, not a generic, because biologics are made in living cells. And we manipulate those cells to make the protein that we want them to make. But the cell is like a human being, right? Every time you go to do something, you might not do it exactly the same. I use the analogy of if you were a really good painter, right, an artist, and you were really well, and you were a good kind of counterfeiter, you might go to the Louvre and try to copy the Mona Lisa. But every single time you tried to copy the Mona Lisa, it would look a little bit different. And somebody who was very knowledgeable would say, that's a copy of the Mona Lisa, but it's really close. And if you put them all together, there would be multiple copies of the Mona Lisa, and they'd be very difficult to tell apart, right? And that's how you have to think about biologic drugs, because not only are the originator drugs a combination of small changes of the molecule that do not affect their activity, but the same thing happens with the biosimilar. We make it in cells. The cells generate this protein, and every time they generate the protein, there might be a minor change in what sugar they put on it or how they do it. The thing they won't change is the backbone. The backbone amino acids have to be identical to that of the originator, and the cell will make that based on the genetic DNA that we've put into the cell. But it can change some minor things. And so what we have to do as a biosimilar company is we have to take apart the originator molecule analytically, and we have to understand the variability of that molecule in multiple lots of the originator. And then we have to remake that molecule, sometimes using different manufacturing techniques. But we have, because of there's been just enormous strides made in analytical characterization and in manufacturing, we can now do that. We couldn't do that earlier on. In fact, we probably know more about the originator molecules today because of the advances in the analytics. So we now know how those drugs vary. And when you make a biosimilar, you have to make it within that standard. You can't have it be more variable than the originator. But I think the important difference between a generic and a biosimilar is that a generic doesn't vary. It's a chemical structure and it always looks the same. Whereas in a biosimilar, it's a combination of that product but with minor variability. And so we're constantly looking about How variable is it? And for the biosimilar, we have to stay within a certain range of that variability. We can't be way off. Great. I hope that helps answer
Thank
that.
you. That's very helpful, and we'll get back to some of those details later in the discussion. So let me actually turn to Dr. Christl from the FDA and just ask briefly, how many biosimilars have been approved so far? How many are in the pipeline? Just to give us a sense of what's out there so far.
Right. So the easy answer first. So the FDA has approved 2 products, biosimilar products. Only one of them is currently marketed, though. So we have approved Zarzio, Filgrastim SNDZ, and we have also approved Remsima, which is infliximab DYYB. So those are the 2 products. Only the Zarzio product is currently marketed. We do expect that the Remsima product will be coming to market, but again, that's not something that we can provide information about when that would occur. If people have questions about that, they would have to contact the company who has that product as to when they plan to launch. So I apologize for the notes, but I know that people really like accuracy in the numbers. So as of May 31st, we have 60 programs that are in the Biosimilar Product Development Program, or the BPD program, that are involving the development of biosimilar products to 19 different reference products. So again, that's 60 programs in the BPD program to 19 different reference products. While we, as an agency, are prohibited from disclosing the existence of pending applications ourselves, we can acknowledge that since program inception and as of May 31st, there's 6 companies that have publicly announced the submission of 9 351K BLAs to FDA. So again, we can acknowledge that. So that's where we're at right now in terms of what we're seeing. That the development space is extremely active. It's growing. Every time someone asks us for the numbers, we have to increase those numbers, which is great. We're seeing a lot of development in the space for these products, and again, we're happy that we're seeing the marketing applications. We've seen over the past 2 years or so a shift in our work just from the development space into the marketing application space, and so we're hoping that over time we will certainly continue to see development to additional reference products. Again, as exclusivity expires, I think you're just going to keep seeing development, new development in this space, and then hopefully additional marketing applications for biosimilar products, and we are ever hopeful to continue to approve more products and have them available to the American public.
Thank you. And just for the uninitiated, you mentioned the BPD program. Can you just spell that out for us, please?
Yes. So I always have to look for the correct term. So it is the Biosimilar Product Development Program. We shorten that down to BPD. So we have a separate user fee program for biosimilar products. They started out under the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, but when that sunsetted, we developed the Biosimilar User Fee Act, or BSUFA. It's capital B, little s, capital U, F, A. So PDUFA is all in capitals. We have a little s for the BSUFA to bring in the biosimilar, mainly because none of us wanted to say BUFA in public. So we went with BSUFA instead. So it has its own user fee program, and because there were no marketed products, when PDUFA first implemented, there were a number of approved products. So one of the fee structure issues is that products pay a product fee, an establishment fee. So when you had a base of products that was there was going to be income coming in right away as soon as that user fee program was implemented. For the biosimilars, there weren't any approved products. And so we implemented something that's called the Biosimilar Product Development, or BPD, process, where companies would pay a development phase fee that's an annual fee to FDA. It's not a fee for service, so it's not a fee per meeting or a fee per advice interaction or letter. It's actually an annual fee, and it would cover any activities and interactions with the agency, either meetings, general correspondence, any sort of interactions, but it allowed the agency to generate revenue to support that program to help support the biosimilar development process.
Hey, Leah, can I just ask, how much of the program does the BSUFA fee cover? Because it seems like it couldn't possibly cover all the work that you have to do So is there a percentage that you expect that to cover?
I can't speak to the specific percentages. The user fee programs always are supposed to cover FDA's activities related to product development and approval. So certainly in the space, there's always other activities such as education and outreach, things that wouldn't be covered by the particular user fees that would go towards product development and approval. So all the user fee programs actually have a trigger, as we call it, out of base appropriations for the FDA budget. And once each program meets the trigger that's in the statute, we then can collect and spend the user fees as a part of that program. So the funds out of appropriations are intended to not just cover the product development and approval activities coupled with the user fees, but also go towards these other aspects such as education and outreach and other program initiatives in the space. And that's across all user fee programs. That concept is the same.
And thank you. And that's a great topic, and maybe we can get into some of those patient education and other programs a little later. But in the meantime, let's go kind of from the bench to the bedside, if you will, and let me turn now to Leigh Purvis and sort of check in. So what does all of this mean for patients? Can you tell us?
I think it really can be summed up in one word, which is access. One thing I haven't really heard mentioned so far in this conversation is the prices associated with biologics. They are incredibly expensive. They can range anywhere from tens of thousands of dollars to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Obviously, that has a huge impact on the people who are taking them. And it has a huge impact on the patients and also on the payers. One example I like to use, because it's been in the news a lot lately and because it's very relevant to the people that I represent, is Medicare Part B, as in boy, which covers outpatient services, including outpatient drugs. In 2014, 9 out of the 10 top spending drugs under Part B were biologics. That should tell you kind of what the program and its beneficiaries are dealing with. Beneficiaries under Part B are responsible for 20% of cost sharing. So 20%, there is no out-of-pocket cap. So if you're prescribed an incredibly expensive drug, you're looking at 20% cost sharing indefinitely. And there are some people who are prescribed incredibly expensive drugs, some of which are biologics, and some of them face cost sharing of more than $100,000 a year. So this has huge implications for the patient and obviously for Medicare as well. We also like to point out that Medicare beneficiaries are not exactly well equipped to handle these kinds of costs. The median income for Medicare beneficiaries is under $25,000, and 1 in 4 have less than $12,000 in savings. So when you're prescribed an incredibly expensive drug, that has real implications for whether or not you're going to be able to take that drug because you can't afford it. And this isn't just unique to Medicare. We're seeing high cost sharing and high costs for payers and patients everywhere in the healthcare system. There are a lot of health payers now that require cost sharing that can exceed as much as 50%. There isn't, I don't think, anyone in this room that can afford 50% of an incredibly expensive drug. So the importance of biosimilars is the competition that will hopefully bring those types of costs down. Patients really need access to these products in order to be able to afford the drugs that they need to get and stay healthy. It really is that simple. So it's incredibly important for us to have access to these products.
Thank you. So let me now turn to Dr. Worthing, who is prescribing some of these drugs. Dr. Finck used the word life-changing, and Leah, of course, pointed out that these are really expensive. And of course, we also heard about the extremely detailed sort of process that it takes to make these. That it's a lot more complicated to make these drugs. So, as a physician, how is the emergence of biologics and biosimilars affecting your day-to-day practice? Is it affecting you yet? How do you see it affecting you in the future?
That's a good question. So biosimilars are not yet available in the rheumatology space. We have the use of the second drug that Leah Christl talked about, which hasn't become available yet, but it's been FDA approved. Biologics, though, I can speak to in general. It's extremely gratifying to take care of people who can go from being almost disabled and not being able to go to work or take care of their family, do their hobbies because of pain in their joints or muscles and other things, and then be able to go back to work after starting one of these breakthrough therapies. And so I look forward to, that's one of the reasons I get up and go to work every day. I look forward to the look on people's faces when they're getting better. And it's heartbreaking to get a phone call or to find out at an office visit that somebody can't afford something, or that there was, a non-medical reason why they couldn't take the therapy. I think rheumatologists are cautiously optimistic about biosimilars, and we are eager to get a lot more information. We're eager for transparency in order to protect our patients, know that these drugs work well before we prescribe them, know all about them and potential adverse effects. And so some of the specific ways that would guarantee that kind of transparency are to have a distinct name between the biosimilar and its reference biologic, to have a process in place where there's a consumer-oriented pharmacy dispensing moment at the point where the patient gets the medication, and also the information that the doctor and the prescriber gets from the FDA, called an FDA label, which is just a treasure trove of very good information. We want that to be also transparent and full of good clinical data. And I think that when those kinds of things come together and that transparency is here, we can be confident in prescribing biosimilars for our patients, and the biosimilars will be proven to work effectively.
Great, thank you. And so we're going to get to some of the issues you raised on naming and labeling. We want to go into a little more detail on those. But before that, let me give Brian Lehman from OPERS a chance to weigh in. So how are you dealing with the emergence of biosimilars at OPERS? And what effect do you think this will have on your covered lives?
Yeah, so for OPERS, biosimilars really are going to impact, we believe, access and affordability. So with our drug spend, one of the biggest drivers of drug spend is specialty biologic drugs. And by 2018, 50% of our overall drug spend will be from specialty biologic drugs. And so the biosimilar products that are coming to market that bring competition will help create an environment of some affordability and access for our members. We truly want to keep our healthcare premiums as low as possible. So biosimilars will help with that. We want to keep our co-pays and co-insurance deductibles affordable as well. So biosimilars will help with that. Specifically for OPERS, it's been projected that we'll save $129 million over 10 years as a result of biosimilars. Nationally, there's been various studies, anywhere between 44 and 250 billion in savings over 10 years. This is something that we need, and we believe is something that's going to, again, help be a solution to offer high quality health plans and not shift too high of cost and too high of co-pays to our members.
Great, thanks. So now that we've set the stage a little bit from some of our different stakeholders, let me turn again to Dr. Christl from FDA and just can you go into a little bit more depth about what you've done so far to implement the BPCIA at the FDA? And what are some of the big issues that you're dealing with?
Right. So in addition to the interactions around product development and also the application review that I think most people would be more familiar with, FDA has developed and issued a number of guidance documents related to interpreting and implementing the BPCI Act. We have a number of final guidances. So far, we have issued general guidance rather than product-specific guidance, again, being in that early implementation and interpretation phase. So we looked at generally the scientific issues about how to demonstrate biosimilarity, focusing on the quality space, the manufacturing space, looking at that analytical similarity and how to demonstrate that from a general scientific perspective, looking at other aspects around non-clinical animal data as well as clinical data and what would be necessary to demonstrate biosimilarity for products. Again, these are general guidances. They talk about the overarching concepts. Each program is unique. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of scenario, and we're really focused in that space. We look at a stepwise development as well as the totality of the evidence that demonstrates biosimilarity. It's very different from standalone drug development, where folks really traditionally think of 2 adequate and well-controlled clinical trials to demonstrate safety and efficacy in a particular indication or condition of use. Here, we're talking about demonstrating biosimilarity to a reference product that's already demonstrated that it's safe and effective. So the types of data that are needed to do that are different, and the concept is very different. And each piece builds on itself in terms of that stepwise evidence development, beginning with the analytical comparisons that are very, very extensive. And as you heard, the science around that has grown so much over the years and continues to grow. And I think that the biosimilar development space is actually pushing the technology.
Yeah.
And I do agree with the statement that we know more now about the reference products from the biosimilars actually analyzing those reference products than maybe we did before. So the technology is there and it's growing more and more over time. So again, that's the foundation of all the biosimilar programs, is that analytical comparison, looking at the structural and functional characterization. So again, we've issued guidance in this space to try to help explain to sponsors as well as be transparent to other stakeholders about the type of information that we would be looking for and what our approach is. We've issued a few what we refer to as question and answer guidances that are more towards more discrete questions about terminology or interpretation of very discrete issues in the BPCIA Act around, again, the interpretation of terminology, looking at pediatric studies, looking at extrapolation, and then those question and answer guidances partner with those general scientific guidances to help support the development conversation and the applications that would eventually come in. Recently, we've issued guidance on labeling and naming. Those are draft guidances. Those are certainly key issues for folks. There's a lot of interest around in those areas. The comment period for the labeling guidance is still open. The comment period for the naming guidance, which issued last year, has closed, but we still take comments even if it's closed. It just depends on when they would come in as to whether or not we would consider them, depending on where we're at in our process of finalizing that guidance. FDA does have on their guidance agenda for 2016 to issue guidance on interchangeability and statistical considerations for the analytical similarity data. So FDA continues to work in that area. FDA also issued guidance on exclusivity provisions, and then also an early guidance looking at the transition provisions that are included, which are very complicated, and if folks have questions about that, I can certainly talk more about that, but it's not the easiest thing to understand. Needless to say, there are some biological products that were historically regulated under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that will now be regulated under the Public Health Service Act, so we say that they transition from one act to the other, so there's a lot of work that the agency needs to do around the space of those products as well.
Thanks. So you've covered a lot of ground here, and we're going to get into some of the details. But you talked a lot about the science and the data and sort of the demonstration of, biosimilarity to a reference product. And by the way, for those who, aren't as familiar, we put a little glossary in your packet. So, and we're happy to add some words to that too, if needed by the end of this. So let me ask Dr. Finck. I mean, what data, how is the science changing? I mean, in the 20 years that you've been doing this, I mean, is the expertise that's needed really different? And then I want to turn to Dr. Worthing and to Leigh and sort of ask, how do you feel, what is needed to interpret this? From the physician standpoint, from the patient standpoint, do they need to interpret it? You talked a little bit about labeling. I want to get into some of those questions a little bit more. So let me start with Dr. Finck.
Well, first of all, I'd like to commend the FDA for actually figuring out how to implement the BPCIA. This is a new program, and it's quite complicated. And I must say that as Coherus, a pure play biosimilar company, we've really had the privilege to work with the FDA and to receive guidance. And although we might not like every guidance we get, it's always done in a fair manner and a case-by-case basis. And there's a lot of thought on the part of the FDA that goes into that. I actually know what it takes inside a pure play biosimilar company to develop one of these. And the analytics and the manufacturing issues are very complex. And on our side, we have assembled experts who've had 20 years of understanding how the cell manufactures the protein, and we have people who understand the cutting-edge analytical tools and analysis that we do. And we need the same thing on the FDA side, because in order for them to guide us and to understand what we're doing, they need the same kind of people with expertise in these cutting-edge technologies. And you're right, I think it's growing. We're learning from each other, and fortunately we do have those people on both sides of at the FDA and in industry, but they're not, they don't grow on trees, let me put it that way. These are hard, it's difficult to find these people, and we need very experienced people to be able to do these analytics. The FDA sets a pretty high bar. They require a statistical test for some of the top tier analytics, and that is a very high bar. It requires us to really purchase many lots of the innovator and to look at them analytically and to look at the variability that I talked about before. And then it has to meet a standard that's a statistical standard. That is a very high bar. But I commend them, the FDA, in setting that bar, because if you know what you're doing, you can meet it. And also, it's reassuring to know that they're taking that kind of a look, a close look at the analytics. Because biosimilarity really is about the analytics. It's about how close the biosimilar is to the innovator molecule. As Dr. Christl said, it's not about 2 well-controlled trials anymore. That the benefit of the drug has already been proven by the originator. It's about how close we match that innovator. If you're very, very close match, you may not even need a clinical trial, right? So it's how much we have confidence in being able to say that analytically, they're very highly similar. And so it's a different mindset. You know, when I came to Coherus, I thought I was a pretty hot drug developer. I developed a lot of drugs. I've done a lot of clinical trials. I'm a board certified rheumatologist. And it took me a couple years to wrap my head around the biosimilar approach. And so it wouldn't surprise me if people in the audience or people in practice or have that same difficulty. And looking at the things we look at when we look at the analytics, as a physician, I was used to looking at clinical data. But for a biosimilar, that's actually not what's the most important thing. You have to show that, yes, it works, and you'd expect the same result in any patient with the biosimilar versus the originator. But we're now looking at charts of peptide maps and gels and impurities and degradation products. And so as a physician, this was new to me. But, you know, I've kind of learned to do it. And I think physicians will, over time, gain that same confidence that the analytics are the most important thing. It's how similar are you on a number of tests. And we run hundreds of tests to look at all the different characteristics of the molecules. So it is complicated, and I don't expect people to immediately grasp how difficult it is. But I don't think we could do it alone. We need the same standard on the FDA and in the physician community and for patients to understand that we are looking at it the same way and that we're together on this, that we are trying to make the highest quality biosimilars and to make them accessible to patients. And that's really why we're doing it on both ends.
Thanks. And so before I turn to Dr. Worthing and Leigh, I just want to remind everyone you can follow along on the hashtag biosimilars on the discussion and tweet your questions, and they will be passed up to me on a green card later in the discussion. So how do we take all this complicated data, you know, and how do we actually make it work for busy doctors, you know, busier patients even? You know, how do you trust that these things are going to work in a similar way to the originator?
Well,
I'd start.
Okay, thanks. And then I'll let you go. I think the most important, so what do I as a doctor want, and where do I get my information about biosimilars? Just like any drug in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, provides a very, very good detailed list of all the clinical data about every drug that's approved. We call the label, and that is probably the best piece of information that we anticipate for biosimilars for doctors. Most of us look at this online, sometimes at the point of care when we're taking care of people. American College of Rheumatology has had several conversations with the FDA and other stakeholders at the federal and state level about the label and about the biosimilar space, fully supportive of what the FDA is doing, like Barbara Finck said. I think an ACR supports a couple of specific pieces in that label, and we saw the first example in rheumatology of this kind of label. Number one, to have a distinct name between the biosimilar and the biologic reference drug, like I said. A listing of all the indications or diseases that the drug has been approved for. Thirdly, whether the drug is an interchangeable drug or not. We get into some of the details of that. The data, like a clinical study, is described in the label, and it's important to make sure that doctors and prescribers and patients know that the data is from, whether it's from the original reference drug or whether it's from the new biosimilar drug. And that's pretty clear right now. And it would also be helpful to have, in addition, maybe a listing of all of the data that's relevant from the new biosimilar, or maybe a hyperlink, since most of us are looking at this online, so we can see what this new compound did and judge for ourselves a little bit about its biosimilarity and give confidence to our patients in that it worked. And I could go on, but maybe I'll stop there since we have
Great.
Lots of people to talk. Yeah,
Thank you. So, Leigh, I mean, are patients even thinking about this right now?
In a word, no. There are very few patients that are aware of what a biologic drug is, much less a biosimilar. And there are still a lot of patients and prescribers that have some level of hesitancy about using traditional generics. So there is kind of a gap between kind of what we would hope patients and prescribers would be doing and what they're actually doing with drugs that have been around for decades. And these are brand new. So it's going to require a pretty substantial and heavy lift in terms of education to get people to understand what these products are and what they mean and why they're important. And that information is going to need to be fair and balanced. If I am going to be brutally honest, there is a lot of money at stake here, and there is an incentive to provide information that perhaps is less than accurate. And we need to make sure that information either doesn't reach patients at all, or at least is balanced with perhaps more accurate information. And that is going to be a really heavy lift. AARP engaged in health reform, and BPCIA was part of that. And we tried to actively engage our members on biologics and biosimilars, and it is an incredibly heavy lift. Again, as you're hearing today, this is an incredibly complex issue, and finding a way to really break that down for prescribers and patients and helping them to understand the importance of these products and why there's nothing to fear is really, really challenging.
Thanks. So Brian, let me turn to you. I mean, are you hearing anything from people who are covered by OPERS or from the physicians?
Sure. And so OPERS is actually involved with interacting with the various stakeholders, interacting with our members through education, interacting through our health plan, educating physicians, educating pharmacists on biosimilars, and I think education is critical, and I think with regards to biologics, biologics when they undergo manufacturing changes actually have to show comparability. So you take a biologic product such as Remicade, and in Europe it's actually had 37 manufacturing changes from 1998 to October of 2014. And when they do those changes, they have to do safety and efficacy studies, these analytical studies, to make sure that the changes are safe and the drug is still effective. The US does the exact same thing. So in biosimilarity, we're doing those same type of studies from the biosimilar product to the reference biologic product. So I think it's important to share with our members, to share with doctors, to share with pharmacists, that connection and create that confidence in these products, because there should be confidence in these products. The FDA is creating a very high standard of approval for these products, and so that's something that we're very much engaged in.
Right. Great. So you mentioned Europe, and talk to me about other countries here. I mean, we have a relatively newer biosimilars market here. So is there anything we can learn from the experience in other countries? What has the experience been? Does anyone want to start us off?
Well, I guess, biosimilars have been in Europe now for many, many years. They're way ahead of us because they started earlier. I think if you look across the board, the two takeaways are that, yes, biosimilars are less expensive in Europe. The uptake and the access of patients to biosimilars in Europe, I think, has been fairly successful. We've not seen safety concerns with switching someone to a biosimilar in Europe. Now, people may say that, well, that's Europe and we're different. You can always say that, and that's why we have the FDA to in our own system. But I think there's confidence. It gives me confidence as a developer of biosimilars that there's nothing that we've seen in Europe that would say, oh, biosimilars are not going to be safe, or that you can't switch someone from a originator molecule to a biosimilar and that they're going to lose response. There may be times when that happens, but I think it makes sense to look at why. For instance, anti-drug antibodies, whether they're made to the originator molecule or the biosimilar molecule, could affect efficacy. But you would expect that to be the same if you're truly a biosimilar. If you're going to be a biosimilar and you make antibodies to one drug, you expect to make them to the biosimilar. I mean, that's part of the biosimilarity, the variability, right? So I think you have to sort of look at the European experience. It's been a wonderful experience, and I think we can have the same advantage here. Importantly here, we don't have the same system. So I think we have to have a conversation that involves everyone. We need to make sure that everybody who's involved in this, changing the dynamic and the costs of our medical care, is involved in the conversation. I mean, I think physicians, patients, payers, the FDA, the manufacturers, and we all need to be able to be on the same page. And we all come at it from different ways, and I think right now we don't really have a forum that takes all of that together when we're talking about a single issue, right? And I would love to see something like that happen. The Affordable Care Act, we were very happy to see it happen, and the biosimilar law, and everybody's trying to go forward in different areas. We're trying to figure out how to do it as a pure play biosimilar company. The FDA is making great strides in trying to give us guidance and tell us how to get that, and to making the standards very high in the United States for biosimilars. But we still can't have one group running off and changing things without having that conversation, because we can get ahead of ourselves and then we have to backtrack. So I'd prefer, if we could in the future, or in the near future, have some forum where a lot of these issues are really faced face to face with, including the patient advocates, including the payers, including the physicians. Because I think we could move a lot faster if we had something like that. I don't know. I'm not from Washington. I don't know how this stuff gets done. I'm just saying I'd like to see it happen.
So,
if I could talk a little bit about,
please.
And Barbara Finck brought up switching and the experience of Europe. I think right now, so there's two ways to think of how the market will take up biosimilars. One is starting a biosimilar drug in a patient who hasn't taken a biologic or hasn't taken the reference biologic yet. I think doctors and rheumatologists will be a lot more comfortable in that space in prescribing. I think there's probably less confidence in the switch or the prospect of switching right at the moment, because we don't know what will happen if somebody switches from the original biologic to a biosimilar and back and forth. FDA has created a pretty high bar, or probably will create a high bar for interchangeability. That's the concept of interchangeability. And so it could be that, just like small molecule drugs, my patient who's doing well on a drug A that's a biologic will do fine, and it will work in her when she switches to a biosimilar and then back to the biologic. But just like we do for small molecule drugs, and they don't become, quote, immune to it. But it might be, and we don't know this specifically, and you're good to ask why would it be if it does happen, that a patient becomes immune to the new biosimilar, and in the worst case might be immune to the biologic switching back. It's because of that that we'll need to make sure that people are not forced to switch in the United States when we take up biosimilars. And I think right now, like I said, we have a lot of confidence as long as there's transparent information that the FDA helps give us good proof about safety and efficacy.
So I want to kind of follow up on this question, then we're going to soon turn to taking questions from the audience. So you can start pulling out those green cards if you have a question. Let me just go to this question of interchangeability and switching. I mean, it seems to me that there's one drug on the market right now, literally, and then in the next few years there may be more. I mean, what kind of data are we going to need to know whether the switching is safe? I know that might get to a regulatory question around interchangeability, but I mean, are we talking about something different now than the analytics that show you have the same molecule, and are we getting more to like clinical post-market surveillance, pharmacovigilance? Can you explain those words and what it is that I'm talking about here, because you're the expert.
I'll give it a go. So I can sort of start with the regulatory legal piece and then maybe move down, because I think, there's a number of stakeholders in the space, and I think that people have to understand and recognize that. And I think that there's varying degrees of understanding and knowledge. It's complicated. It's very, very complicated. And I will say, there's a number of areas, FDA as well as other organizations, that are looking at education and outreach efforts. And the messaging around that is different amongst the stakeholder communities. What we can say to prescribers versus patients is quite different. Biologics are complicated. You explained it with having a forger for art. I tend to explain biologics in beer and wine. People totally understand fermentation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure about that.
It always works. It's great. They understand that. So again, the knowledge level is very, very different. So, when we start moving into these other more complicated spaces, when we talk about interchangeability, not just biosimilarity, folks need to understand that the U.S. is the only regulatory agency. The FDA in the U.S. is the only regulatory agency, and the U.S. is actually the only country that has a law that distinguishes biosimilarity versus interchangeability. So this is a very new space, and so we can look at the European experience and other ex-US experience around biosimilarity, but not necessarily for what our statutory standard is for interchangeability. There are some activities in other areas of the world where patients will be changed from one product to another, but when we talk about switching in the US, what it is that the BPCIA states is that interchangeability is an additional standard over biosimilarity. We don't say it's a higher standard because biosimilarity is not a lesser standard. And the thing that people have to understand is that abbreviated approval pathway, which is what biosimilarity is, it again is not a lesser standard in comparison to what would be the originator or reference product. The standard for approval of safety and effectiveness are the same. It's the data elements that underlie that are different. So people need to understand, and that's one of the biggest, I think, misunderstandings and misnomers. They hear that abbreviated approval pathway and think it's a lesser standard. It's not. FDA won't approve a biosimilar product if it doesn't meet that standard of safety and effectiveness. Again, it's the data elements that get you there that are different between the two pathways. So interchangeability is an additional standard over biosimilarity. It encompasses a standard for biosimilarity, and then in addition, a sponsor would need to provide data or information that demonstrates that the product is expected to produce the same clinical result in any given patient. And then for products that are given more than once to a patient, that the impact of switching or alternating on safety and effectiveness of the product are evaluated in comparison to just staying on the reference product. I'm somewhat limited in what I can say in terms of the data elements to support interchangeability because, again, we haven't issued guidance on interchangeability, but I think folks can look at the statutory definition and say there's going to be some additional data or information that will have to go towards addressing those additional elements that are part of the definition of interchangeability. I don't think that people should assume in all cases it's going to have to be clinical data, that there will have to be an evaluation of switching or alternating in every condition of use or every indication. But it will need to be addressed in every scenario. But I think it remains to be seen, just as we've done for biosimilarity, that there's no one-size-fits-all. It's a stepwise development. We look at the totality of the evidence to support that standard. I think that you would expect that it would be the same type of an approach. Again, interchangeability encompasses biosimilarity, but there is that additional standard that will have to be looked at. So there is the expectation of additional data and information that would go towards that.
Let me ask one other follow-up, and then what we're going to do is open it up to questions from the audience. But the Alliance has had past briefings on things like medication adherence, and we've all heard the stories of the patient who goes to the hospital, gets prescribed some new drug, comes home, has a yellow pill and another yellow pill, thinks they're the same. I mean, how is this going to change in the realm of biosimilars? Are we talking about pills that people bring home from the pharmacy, or are we talking more about the injectables and the infusion drugs? And so, I mean, how does that weigh into this issue of, frankly, which one is prescribed and which one the patient gets? Does anyone want to try that one?
Well, first of all, biologics generally are not pills, all right? So biologics are proteins, and you can't take them in pill form because the acids in your stomach would destroy them and they wouldn't be effective. So we are talking about injectable drugs or infused drugs. And so you will be able to see the difference. In most cases, first of all, they'll come with a label on it and tell you who manufactured it. But it's really a question of that trust that what you're getting you can expect as a physician or as a patient, that your response to that, your biological response to that, will be within the variability of what's expected for the originator. So, it's again a similarity issue, not a saying, oh, this is an effective drug in this indication. It's really saying, can the physician and the patient expect to have the same response to the drug over time? Now, we know over time there are patients who have biologics who have not had a biosimilar who lose their response, right? So we need to make sure that it's not due to the biosimilar, but we also have to keep in mind that this is an occurrence that it happens even with the originator. So we need to figure out how to understand that data and how to manage it. I think we have to be sure that we're constantly looking at the evidence and not one side or the other, right? I mean, this is really about patients and their safety and their response to the drug, and actually, quite honestly, their economic health. Because if they can't afford a drug, well, they're not going to have any response, right? So I think this is a way to provide safe medications to patients in an affordable way, and that they should be able to, over time, gain confidence that they will have, these are safe, they're coming, they're safe, and they should be looking forward to these with anticipation. I think we also need to look at what's coming in down the line with new therapies. New therapies, we have some incredible cutting-edge technology that's bringing new medications, and you obviously are proving them every day at the FDA. There's some really exciting stuff happening in medicine today, and those drugs are going to be expensive. So we have to sort of decrease the base or the standard of care so that there's headroom for these new biologics and new medications. Not all of them are biologics, some of them are chemical, but they're going to be expensive. Pills that treat hepatitis C are expensive, right? So we need to make room for those very expensive new cutting-edge technologies, or medicine doesn't move forward. So there's a real reason for all of us to be very proactive in moving this field forward, this biosimilar field forward.
Well, with that, let me open up the floor to questions from the audience. And if you would, sir, come to the microphone to ask a question. If you don't want to stand at the microphone, you want to write your question on a green card that you should have in your folder, please do that, and someone will come around and bring it up to me. Or you can tweet your questions to the hashtag biosimilars. So if you would just identify yourself and then state your question, please. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Hausfeld. I'm a retired otolaryngologist, facial plastic surgeon, and the founder of an organization called SOAP, Society of Physician Entrepreneurs. We have about 25,000 members, and we try to help healthcare bring their innovations to patients. So I wanted to share with you some reflections and ask some questions. Because I've been practicing or had practiced for such a long time, many of you don't remember the time when we were asked to switch from branded drugs to generic drugs. Both patients and physicians were very reluctant 35 years ago to do that. And the drug reps that came visiting my office kept telling me how their branded drug was always better than the generic drug. And the 3 letters that I remember writing on my prescription pads were DAW, dispense as written. And that forbade the pharmacist from giving them a generic drug. Well, what's happened over years is that both physicians and patients have realized that generic drugs do work. There is a quality standard that we enforce in their manufacturing, and the same, if not a better, manufacturing enforcement will be done for biologics. The difference now is that there was no incentive for physicians to basically say, take the generic drug, but now with value-based care, when the physician's reimbursement will be based on the total amount spent on that patient, that's a very good argument for bringing biosimilars into the market. That's one. Second is, I've also am the chairman of the board and chief medical officer of a biotech company in Frederick, Maryland that produces biosimilars. Our first biosimilar is Synagis. Synagis is a monoclonal antibody used for respiratory syncytial virus in premature infants. It is an excellent drug with a terrific track record and really has prevented the deaths of hundreds of thousands of premature infants. Because of the cost of the drug, however, we've changed our guidelines in that we used to give the drug to 34-week-old premature infants, but because of the cost, we've reduced that to only giving it to 29-week-old premature infants, leaving a large gap of infants that probably won't die as a result of them not getting the drug, but probably will be hospitalized and may have lifelong sequential pulmonary and immunologic disorders as a result of not getting an effective, good drug because of its cost. This is a great story for why biosimilars has to be adopted into our present system to make it more accessible for that very vulnerable population.
So, sir, if I could ask you to get to your question and so others can get to theirs, thank you.
Okay. FDA question, biobetters. How tolerant are you in that now we're asked not to have proteins, animal proteins, and to have serum-free formulations in our biosimilars? How tolerant will the FDA be if during that process we find that the immunogenicity of the biosimilar is better than the originator drug? Will that then put it into a category of being a biobetter, requiring a novel drug application versus a biosimilar?
Right, and I think that that's going to be a product-specific issue that would have to be addressed. At some point, again, for those who don't know, the standard for biosimilarity, one of the standards is that there's no clinically meaningful differences. So it doesn't say it's in one direction or the other, and FDA has taken the approach and articulated in guidance that it does look at both sides of that equation of it's not worse, it's not better within a certain pre-specified range. Now, there certainly is tolerance on that upper side, but it wouldn't lead to a claim, per se, and the approach that FDA has taken to labeling is that if you've demonstrated biosimilarity, you essentially we'll have in the biosimilar labeling the safety and efficacy information, which would include the immunogenicity data that would come from the reference product labeling, because what the data did was demonstrate biosimilarity. At some point, though, from a public health perspective, if it was that much better, I think that the agency would want to have a conversation with that applicant as to whether or not the better pathway for that product would be a standalone development, and to be able to make that claim and have that data and information out there, to protect the public health. But again, I think it depends on the product, and I think it depends on the degree of difference, and we would have to see what the tolerability was around that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So bio-better, another word we may want to add to the glossary. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I want to say thank you to the panelists before I ask my question for the great afternoon. I'm a congressional intern for Congressman Pete Sessions out of Dallas, Texas. And so my question is, we've talked about the high price of biosimilar drugs and how they're inaccessible to patients because of that. I'm not quite sure how you all are familiar with the bill, the world's greatest healthcare bill, that's being introduced to the floor by my congressman. I was wondering if that bill, in combination with the FDA programs that you've spoken of, could make these biodrugs or biologic drugs more accessible to patients, and if not, what could Congress do to possibly accommodate, to make them more accessible?
Thanks. And if I can add on to your question, for those who go ahead and try to answer that, but there were a few questions on the green cards here about costs and how much savings we can actually anticipate. So if you could go ahead and try to incorporate that in answering the young lady's question. Thank you.
You're looking at me, Leah, like.
I have to defer to others on cost.
Yeah. So if you want to, who's the cost person?
Please.
Okay. So in terms of cost savings estimates, they really are kind of varied. But in general, the expectation is between 25 and 30% off the price of the biologic drug. So biosimilars will see savings, especially if you consider the fact that biologics are so incredibly expensive to begin with. We are traditionally used to seeing with traditional generics a cost difference of around 90%, and that's obviously much larger. But again, when you're talking about a higher priced product to begin with, 25-30% is still a substantial savings.
I don't think I made my question clear. It's more in terms of it's under the current healthcare plan now with the costs you're talking about. Could that price vary if this new healthcare plan passes, or if there's any other way to increase the savings by patients? What is another bill that you possibly propose, or another act that could be?
So let me try. I'm not familiar. As I said, I'm from way out there on that West Coast, so I'm not familiar with every bill that's going through Congress. But anything that Congress can do to try and get biosimilars approved and have access for patients, I applaud. I think it's also, there's several things that could happen. One, Congress could pass an appropriations to fund the FDA in their efforts to develop biosimilars. It's been a long time, as my understanding is that the FDA has been working without an appropriations, and I think that's, I applaud them in what they've been doing and able to do, but they obviously have to be robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? And at some point with what did you say, Leah? You've got 60 or something coming through this year. It's really important that Congress focus on funding the development of biosimilars at the FDA.
Agree.
Can I just jump? Yep, go ahead.
I was going to add too, in terms of a piece of legislation, the CREATES Act was something that was just introduced here, S3056, and that's something, there's a practice that's currently going on where brand manufacturers are withholding some of the drug samples to biosimilar manufacturers so those products can't come to the marketplace. So any kind of legislation that helps bring more biosimilars to the marketplace is going to be more advantageous for us. And
can I, as an industry person and who's dealing every day with that exact issue, access to the originator for our clinical trials is a major issue. And when we, like for instance, I'll just give you a number. If we do a phase 1 bioequivalence study, that drug, the originator drug, could cost us $1 million. Now we're a small company, but that's a big deal. I sometimes feel working for a biosimilar company that I'm actually funding the originator companies because I have to buy so much of their drug. In fact, we oftentimes go to Europe to get the innovator because it's almost half the cost. And then we have to do special trials within the US to bridge that. But just on a cost basis, sometimes we do our trials that way. We'd prefer to do them with the US innovator if the filing is going to be in the US, but cost-wise, it's enormous. So I feel the same pain that patients and payers feel when they have to buy a lot of drugs that are very high price. And so any access that we can improve would help. I think another area that could really help is to cover these under Part D of Medicare. My understanding is that the biologics were somehow left out of the Part D donut hole. And, they're still not going to be inexpensive. They're going to be greatly reduced costs. But patients should have the advantage of being able to count those in their out-of-pocket and getting through the donut hole faster. So, I think there's a lot of things. I'd love to see Congress focus on biosimilars, and anything you can do to help your congressman get these kinds of things through, I applaud.
Well, that bill is being passed, it's introduced now, so you guys have any things against it?
Let's
do it. There have been a bunch of issues raised, so let me, and Dr. Worthing looks like he really wants to say something, and then I actually want to get to the Medicare question because we didn't really get much of a chance to address that so far in the panel. So did you want to add a comment?
Oh, I thought I'm familiar somewhat with the bill. It has the best name, I think, on the Hill right now. Like everything coming out of Texas, it's the world's best, world's greatest. But and I'm married to a Texan, so I guess I
have to say that.
So the bill allows what I think would be a group of patients who are proactive and very thoughtful about their care to invest their own and their employer's money and monies from the government into their health care. It would need to be a lot of money to be relevant for purchasing a biosimilar, which run in the range of $20,000 and up per year. And so somebody, once they're started on that kind of drug, would need to be pretty careful within the confines of that plan, that option that is allowed to people. If they were to purchase a plan that allowed them to pay for 20% of a biologic cost for the year, that would be a lot of money. But a biosimilar may save them 20%, and so it may be not much difference. But if it's if they're paying for more than that, if they're paying up for a lot of it, and that gap isn't closed, it rapidly adds up to a lot of money.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
We have someone at the mic, and then there's a few really good questions on the cards.
Joe Williams with Congressional Quarterly. I had two questions for FDA on naming. You put out a Federal Register notice that proposed 10, or that manufacturers proposed 10 suffixes when submitting an application. Is that currently being required of manufacturers to submit those 10 suffixes when they bring an application to the agency? And my second question was, there's currently no final naming rule. When that is issued, will currently approved biosimilars have to alter their name?
Right, so in terms of the first question, the Federal Register notice had to do with what's called the Paperwork Reduction Act. So anytime that the government asks someone to submit something to them, they have to do an evaluation of the burden that would be. And so FDA, in this case, had to make an estimate of what that burden could be and then talk about the time and the financial repercussions of that for sponsors. So in terms of the 10, that was a number that had gone forward as a part of that Paperwork Reduction Act process in terms of estimating the burden towards or for the stakeholders to follow through with that process. So within the context of individual development programs, I can't say, again, that's proprietary information, but again, that number of 10 had just gone towards the general concept that would go towards the Paperwork Reduction Act and the estimating the burden for transmitting that information or providing that information to the government. Your second question, certainly once a final policy is put into place, it would be expected at that point that any of the products would then align with that final policy. As to how that would come about, I can't speak to that because I think that would be part of whatever final policy is ultimately in place as to the process for that. And there were certainly questions that were asked in the notice that accompanied the draft guidance about how to look at prospective application of any naming policy versus retrospective application of any naming policy. And if folks remember, there was a proposed rule that accompanied the draft guidance that had proposed changing the non-proprietary name of certain products that were selected based on public disclosure, either of approving a biosimilar, so the filgrastim SNDZ, the Zarzio product was included in that, as well as publicly disclosed proposed biosimilars to certain reference products. Those reference products were included in that notice as well. So that was just a small piece in the retrospective space. So again, I think that the agency would have to develop plans around not just the prospective product approval, but also the retrospective. But I think that remains to be seen as the final policy is determined.
Any timeline on that final policy?
Again, we all have wish lists of when we would like to get through things. There's an FDA component of it in terms of drafting and our own internal clearance, but there's also an external clearance process in terms of once it leaves the agency that we don't have control over those timelines. So it's very difficult for us to predict. But certainly that guidance and moving towards finalizing that guidance, again, the comment period closed. So FDA is definitely working through those comments and working towards developing final guidance. We know it's very valuable to the stakeholders, so it is a priority for us.
Thank you. And just so that nobody leaves here without understanding what we're talking about here with naming, can you just briefly share, so what is at stake here with the naming? Dr. Worthing mentioned having different names for the different biosimilars. Can you just briefly explain what the policy is? And
Right. So again, FDA had put out draft guidance regarding the non-proprietary naming of biological products. So folks can think of, so there's a proprietary name that folks can think of as the trade name or the brand name. And then there's the non-proprietary name of the product. For biological products, it can also be referred to as the proper name. So when we talk about the product that we've heard a little bit of discussion about in the RA space, so Remicade as a reference product, the Remicade is the trade name or the brand name or the proprietary name. Infliximab is the non-proprietary name or the proper name of that product, and that refers to the drug substance or the chemical structure of the product. FDA issued draft guidance regarding the non-proprietary name of all biological products, with some exceptions that were noted in the guidance, that a suffix would be appended to a shared cord name. So any products that contain that infliximab drug substance would have that infliximab name, but then each different product would have a different suffix that was attached to it. FDA had put this out in terms of a draft policy focusing on safe use of biological products, preventing inadvertent substitution of products in particular that FDA didn't determine were interchangeable, but also a large focus on pharmacovigilance. Pharmacovigilance we've heard a little bit about. Again, to put it in very simple terms, once a product is approved, it's being able to collect adverse event data, get any sort of use data once it's approved in the marketplace, and looking at how to identify certain information with certain products and being able to link that. And so FDA articulated in the draft guidance their policy position that having that unique identifier that would be attached for each product would allow product-specific identification in the post-approval space of these products and to help pharmacovigilance. So if there was a problem with one product, the agency wouldn't need to pull all the products off the market, that you would be able to identify that one product that may have the issue and target towards that product. So again, there's a number of stakeholder views in this area, that really run the gamut of we don't need to do this up to, there is a need to distinguish the products. And, the FDA did receive a lot of comments. They're all public. So the guidance is public. The docket where comments were submitted is public. Anyone can go and look at those comments and see the range of comments as FDA is working through those towards a final policy.
Leah, can you talk a little bit why the random number, letter or alphabets afterwards and the suffix? I mean, to me, that I can't understand how the physician can actually use that. Do they have to write that? Or if they want to write for infliximab, a particular biosimilar, do they have to know that code, or can they just write infliximab? And then when it gets to the pharmacy uses that code. I think it's not clear to physicians how they're going to actually use that. And, it could represent a problem, right? I mean, if a physician's not going to remember that random alphabet code at the end of the etanercept. And right now, if you're a physician, you write etanercept, it's a non-proprietary name. The pharmacy can choose the etanercept or whatever it has, right? Or infliximab, whatever it has. And if they're forced to remember this random four letters, they probably won't. They'll probably start prescribing by brand name. Then what brand name do they know the best? They know the originator brand name, right? So it actually disadvantages the biosimilar. So I'm just curious why it went to a code that was sort of random.
So thanks for that question, and maybe let Dr. Worthing and Leigh kind of weigh in on sort of the names, and then we have someone who's been very patiently waiting at the mic. We still have a lot of great questions on the green cards, and we have about 15 minutes left in the discussion, so hopefully folks will stick around and hear the rest of the discussion. So, I mean, what's in a name? Sorry, I said I wasn't going to quote Shakespeare, and now I did.
That's great. I'll be quick.
Why do we care about this?
You mentioned the hypothetical person coming home from the hospital and doesn't know which pill is which, and so the FDA, I think individual distinct names, whether they're random or not, I wouldn't choose to comment on personally as a physician, but that helps us. That distinct name does both the things that Dr. Christl said. It tells us which drug, manufacturer, all the history that you can go to the label, and it also prevents inadvertent substitution, because if it's different from the originator name, it can't be substituted. Mm-hmm. Until, of course, there's some sort of interchangeable designation. So it does those things really well.
Okay, and let me follow on, because there have been a few questions here about substitution. Can you just address when we talk about substitution, we sort of hear the term substitution at the pharmacy counter, things like that, but we've already established that these are not so much the drugs you go and get at the pharmacy counter, perhaps. So can you address just that briefly, and then we'll just see if anyone else wants to weigh in on that, and then we'll get to your question.
Substitution is hypothetical right now because FDA has set up a system in which a biosimilar, like the two out right now, wouldn't be interchangeable. In some future time, we may have interchangeable drugs that would then maybe be substitutable. During that time, if a drug were to be approved as a interchangeable, is the right name, biologic, I think, and the ACR supports the concept of notifying the patient and the prescriber quickly beforehand or very soon after. Etanercept, like the doctor mentioned, is given within 3 days or maybe 7 days in those frequent intervals, so we would want to know quickly if something had been changed, because we're in a new space and we want to monitor for safety and efficacy.
Thanks. Leigh, Brian, any thoughts on those issues?
Yeah, I would say on interchangeability, and I'm a pharmacist, some of the specialty drugs, the biologic drugs, are a subset of specialty drugs. The pharmacist is a part of that decision making on whether or not that something can be substituted. AMCP actually did a survey, and 37.3% of pharmacists weren't confident with substituting if there was a suffix on the name because of added confusion. But this is something, substitution in the generic space and interchangeability in the biologic space is something that's going to be very important. And the generic marketplace has been very successful because of substitutability, and I believe personally that the interchangeable biologic space will be very successful if it is interchangeable and it is allowed to be substituted by a pharmacist. And there is state legislation going on right now, and people in the audience are probably familiar with it, and it's being passed throughout the country. It's important that legislation, and some of the states require that legislation in order for a pharmacist to substitute. a biologic drug, because in the state regulations, it has generics but not biologics. But as pharmacists, we want the ability to continue to have that ability to substitute the drug for a patient when it's safe and efficacious for the patient.
You probably haven't heard too much of this today, but this is actually a very contentious debate, so I'll just put that on the table when I respond to this. AARP's position has always been that FDA is fully capable of regulating biosimilars. If they can regulate biologics, they can regulate biosimilars. And a lot of what we're seeing right now in terms of substitution and saying we need to do XYZ for substituting biosimilars because they're different really kind of plays into this narrative that there's something to be afraid of. And the fact of the matter is, we don't think there is. We think these products are important. We think they're safe. We don't think they need to be treated differently. And to us, that's a concern, because the more barriers you put in front of substituting these products for the more expensive version, the less savings we're going to see, the less patients you're going to have having access to these products. And to us, that is a much larger concern. Again, we think FDA has the safety and the effectiveness covered. We want the competition. And the competition is only going to come if you allow these products to be substituted.
Thank you. You've been very patient. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations today, or the panel discussion. My name is Tiffany McCaslin. I'm with the National Business Group on Health. So we represent large employers as payers or purchasers of healthcare. And my question goes along with the previous dialogue on interchangeability. I wanted to get the developer perspective and also the provider perspective, thinking theoretically in the future, once FDA issues its guidance on interchangeability, to the extent there is an additional clinical data component, can you just comment on, from the developer perspective, how that may impact your bottom line in terms of bringing these drugs to market, and comment, maybe more broadly on what that means to costs for patients? And then from the provider perspective, what meaningful differences that sort of takes your mind to as you think about writing these drugs for patients?
Well, I don't know what the additional information that will be required for interchangeability is yet. I think there are a lot of people who are second guessing and moving forward with multiple switch trials or clinical trials. I don't even know if it's going to be a clinical requirement. So I think we kind of have to wait and see what the guidance is. But I think interchangeability is important. It's incredibly important for us to move this field along and to have to provide access to patients of these drugs, and I agree that the pharmacist can do that. I don't think the physician needs to be left out. Again, it's the call for everybody to find a common ground. I think we have a really great pharmacovigilance system in this country, and I don't think we have to be worried that we have to invent a new one. The costs for us will be dependent on what that is. But I think given the fact that we're absolutely committed to bringing these biosimilars to market and that we want them to be high quality, we'll welcome what that is. I mean, I don't think it's going to be that we have to do a clinical trial in every indication for which the innovator is approved. Right? I mean, I'm pretty sure that's not what you're going to make us do. But there may be additional patient populations that they want us to look at in a small way or things like that. And I don't think that those costs are going to be prohibitive for us to bring biosimilars forward. I mean, we're already committed. We're completely focused, laser focused on getting this done. But we'd like to do it in a way that includes everybody, and that this is a really great forum because everybody's got a voice here, and I think it's one of the first opportunities.
Right. So, Dr. Worthing, and then I actually want to also ask Brian to weigh in just briefly on, as a payer yourself, kind of what are some of the tools or some of the things that you're looking at with respect to this market? Go ahead.
Like I said, rheumatologists are looking forward to prescribing biosimilars. I think if I could sum up what I mentioned about the theoretical patient who's switching back and forth between medications, it's all just about making sure that we have the transparent data. We know the data going into, before we prescribe it, that it's going to be safe and that it's going to work just as well as the drug that they're currently taking. And just to paint the picture, it's not about fear. It's just that a patient might have tried 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 pill, like sort of older pill versions of drugs first, if they have rheumatoid arthritis. They may have had 1 or 2 experiences with biologics, either with one that didn't work or one that had an adverse effect. And so for that person is much more invested than I am about this switch back and forth. And they would just want to be clear and be sure that it's going to work. I think that's all we're talking about.
Yeah, I think patients do get sort of attached to their drug, right? I take a simvastatin tablet, and every time I get it, it's this pink kind of oval thing. And one day I went and got it, and it was a little round pink thing. And I thought the pharmacist had given me the wrong pill, right? So I called them up, and I said, did you actually give me simvastatin? Because it doesn't look like my simvastatin. And they said, yeah, it's just a different generic manufacturer. And then I looked on the label, and there was the generic manufacturer, and it was different than what I'd been taking. But I felt totally confident in taking it, and I haven't noticed any difference whatsoever, right? My lipids haven't gone up. So, I think the same thing. I think when you think about what data you need, I think you have to trust the fact that the FDA has scrubbed this, and if they're saying it's biosimilar, then it's got the same effect, it should be as safe, and analytically, it's very highly similar, right? So I think we'll get there, and I understand the reticence on the part of physicians and patients. I'm there too as a physician, but I've actually seen these biosimilars being developed, and I actually would be confident in myself taking one. So I think that when you get used to the data and you get used to seeing the results, you won't feel that you have to have a separate label for every biosimilar. It's just like generics. You know what this drug should do, and the FDA's told you that's what it should do. They've already put it to a high standard.
Would you have appreciated a call or a text or an email saying, by the way, your pill's now pink, it's the same thing?
I wouldn't have minded, but I was,
That's
it wasn't that I required it. I was able to look at it and say, oh, that's different. And you remember, most of these biosimilars are going to have different auto-injectors. They're going to have different, possibly different syringes.
They're going to be very different.
They're going to be quite different. So I think that they might be a shock to a patient who's getting them interchanged or transitioned. Okay. But I think in time, they might actually like it, right? It's costing them less, and it works just as well. So
substitution, interchangeability, big questions. Clearly, we're not going to
no, we're not going to solve this
today. We still have 4 days left this week, though. We have 5 minutes left. If you would kindly, please. Just remember to fill out a little blue evaluation form before you leave. I want to give Brian a chance, though, as one of the payers on the ground, to just kind of weigh in, and then we'll see if we have time for sort of one quick final round statement from everyone.
So for healthcare purchasers like OPERS, in order to, on the ground, in the trenches, what we're trying to do in terms of trying to help increase the uptake of biosimilars is get involved with plan design. So plan design, especially under the pharmacy benefit, it could be Medicare Part D or just under the pharmacy benefit, what we're doing in 2017 is creating a specialty drug tier and a generic specialty drug tier / biosimilar tier. So this is going to help reduce co-pays and cost share for individuals who will utilize specialty drugs under the pharmacy benefit. Currently, there is no drug under the pharmacy benefit. Etanercept is being reviewed by an FDA advisory committee. We hope that might be the first biosimilar under the pharmacy benefit. Humira is also, might be one under the pharmacy benefit, but it's important that there be some incentive potentially for the patient to help them have more access and be able to afford those products under the pharmacy benefit. Payers, working with health plans and PBMs, we work with them in terms of their management of these drugs, and specifically with the PBMs. We're talking about different programs like their formulary, because they look at drugs and they pick whether the drug's going to be covered or not covered. We talked with the PBM about that, and I think actually one of the potential biggest threats to biosimilars under the pharmacy benefit, and under the pharmacy benefit the patient would likely inject the drug, is PBMs and payers potentially restricting the coverage of those products. So that could be, you bring a product to market and then all of a sudden the biologic reference company comes with a rebate and your drug's not even on a formulary and patients aren't going to use it. So we have those conversations with the pharmacy benefit managers. Education, critical. We've done multiple pieces of education with our members, multiple pieces of education with the physicians. We talk with pharmaceutical companies. I think all of us have to work together in terms of educating on safety and efficacy of biosimilars, or the marketplace is just not going to take off. And then provider reimbursement, making sure that providers are actually not negatively being reimbursed, but having a positive financial incentive on reimbursement. And then OPERS is involved with legislative and regulatory affairs that involve biosimilars.
Thank you. So let me just ask, I want to end on the sort of patient and education note. There was a question on a card about FDA's role in doing this. If I could ask you to just expand on that a little bit, Dr. Christl, and then I want to kind of go down the line here and sort of ask everybody to just share, what are the key takeaways that you think basically the American public needs to know about biosimilars. So go ahead first.
So very quickly, in the education and outreach space, FDA very much has a role in this space, and it's something that we have been working on and we will continue to work on. We publicly stated in a number of instances that we had a couple of contracts with outside organizations to look at messaging development as well as testing. So going out and doing surveys in the prescribing community in various types of formats. And asking what people knew about biosimilars and taking that back and looking at, well, where do we need to do messaging? Creating messaging around it, going back out and testing it and saying, do you understand this messaging? Again, it's very important for folks to understand what biosimilars are, what they're not, the differences between biosimilars and interchangeable products. Other efforts in this space, including not to drop this in at the last minute, but FDA does have the purple book. Folks might be familiar with the orange book for the small molecule chemically synthesized products. So FDA has developed a purple book for biological products that does list out all the approved biological products, and then as we approve biosimilars and then ultimately interchangeable products, those are associated with the reference product, and it does say whether the product is biosimilar or interchangeable. So that information is publicly available. We're hoping it's a resource that pharmacists and prescribers will look at, and in addition to patients if they so choose. But we think it will be a resource the same way that the Orange Book is a resource for pharmacists in looking at therapeutic equivalence types of ratings and substitution issues around the drug products that have been approved. So FDA, again, is looking at message testing. We're having a number of stakeholder listening meetings with patient organizations, with provider organizations, and trying to find out what it is that they would like us to do, where their understanding is or isn't. We've done a number of drop-in articles into newsletters or other types of communication vehicles for these organizations, and we're very happy to do that. We think, again, that it's important that FDA stands behind these products and that we talk about our approval standards and that folks understand what it is that we're looking at from a scientific perspective and find a way to communicate with the patient and prescribing community in a way that they understand what the standards are. The BPCIA Act is complicated wording, and it's not accessible language to your average consumer by any stretch of the imagination. So it's important that we partner with these other organizations and work with them, take advantage of their outreach efforts that they have with their own base of stakeholders and constituents, and that we work with them to develop messaging in that space, and it's something that we plan to continue to do.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so starting with Brian, and we'll work our way back to me. Key takeaways in a sentence or two, if you would.
Sure. My key takeaway is for the audience here is that biosimilars are safe and effective. This is a complex topic, but they are safe and effective. And the FDA has high stringent protocols for reviewing biosimilars. And when you look at European experience, there's actually been 400 million days of patient days of safe and effective use of biosimilars in Europe. And what I would like is ask of the audience is support on any kind of legislation or regulation that helps the biosimilar interchangeable biologic marketplace be successful.
I want to thank the Alliance for Health Reform and my fellow panelists. It's been a great discussion today. It's sort of easy to get lost in the weeds of the regulatory issues about this with the naming and labeling, interchangeability, but they do have real and profound health consequences for our patients who rely on these therapies to manage their conditions. The American College of Rheumatology appreciates all the work of Leah Christl and her colleagues at the FDA that they're doing right now to ensure that the therapies are safe and effective. Thanks.
Thanks.
I think an important takeaway is that we have been hearing a lot about prescription drug spending lately, and biologics are a huge part of that, and they're going to be an even larger part going forward. There are a lot of these products in the pipeline, and it's going to make it even more important to ensure that we have a thriving and competitive biosimilar market if we're going to have any chance of getting prescription drug spending under control.
Thanks.
I'd just like to say that biosimilars are coming. They are safe. The FDA holds all the manufacturers of biosimilars to a very high standard. I think we can trust their judgment when they say something is biosimilar or interchangeable. And I think we should not be afraid. We can be anxious, but let's not be afraid. All right? And let's change the dynamic. And we have an opportunity to do that right now. And I'd like to encourage us to continue to have more dialogue like this where everyone's voices are heard, and if that can be in some more like a working group or a commission or something like that, I'd love to see that happen. And to you who are helping us get legislation on the books that will help patients pay for these medications, I commend you, and the more we have of that, the better.
Great.
Thank you for a really nice day.
Thank you. So great. So we've gone from words like naming and labeling and interchangeability to words like transparency and access and confidence. And I think at the end, you know, those are words are what it's all about. So I want to thank all of you for listening today and for being here and for your really fantastic questions. And thank you to our panel. Please join me.